Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our March Business Builder event. I am Justine Paradiso, the Marketing and Programs Manager with the Dubuque Area Chamber of Commerce, and myself, along with our board chair, Darren Harmon, and the entire Chamber's team are so glad that you decided to join us this Tuesday morning. Before we begin, I want to thank our sponsors. Our ultimate presenting sponsors are Medical Associates Clinic and Health Plans, Midwest One Bank, Q Casino, and TH Media. And our platinum sponsors, Anderson Window and Door, Cartograph, Collins Community Credit Union, Digital Dubuque, Envision, Fidelity Bank, Fourge Social, Grand River Center, Grand River Medical Group, Holiday Inn, John Deere Dubuque Works, Mercy One Dubuque, Stonehill Communities, Town Square Media, Unity Point Health Dubuque, and US Bank. It is my privilege to introduce today's presenter, Anna Johnson with Fourge Social, as she shares better marketing begins with storytelling. Anna is the Creative Solutions Manager at Fourge Social and holds a passion for her work as widespread as the industries her clients represent. A 2018 graduate of Loras College, she began her career at Fourge nearly 5 years ago and has been making strides developing creative and effective strategy for Fourge's clients and team members. Anna is a certified social media strategist through the National Institute for Social Media and is fueled by the ever-changing landscape of digital marketing. In her spare time, Anna enjoys serving as the director of social media on the Young Professionals Dubuque board, volunteering, and traveling whenever possible. Please give a warm welcome for Anna Johnson.
Thank you so much, Justine. I'm going to make sure that my screen is shared here so that way everybody can see my presentation for us to get started. All right, hopefully everybody can see my screen now. It's a pleasure to be here this morning with all of you for the Business Builder Workshop this month presented by the Chamber of Commerce. I hope everybody has a cup of coffee or a cup of tea or something nice to kick off their Tuesday along with this presentation. So as you all know, we're going to be chatting about how better marketing starts with storytelling, and I'm going to ask you one question right at the beginning of the workshop, and otherwise I'll let you kind of settle in, drop any additional questions you have in the chat, and then we'll certainly do a Q&A at the end if you have any questions as we move through the presentation. All right, so Molly and Justine did a fantastic job of introducing me, and I'll just say once again that my name is Anna Johnson. I'm the Creative Solutions Manager at Fourge Social, which basically is a really fun way of saying that I get to be a social media account manager, and I have the privilege of supporting our team through professional development, client work, and so much more. Take just a moment to picture a traditional office space, maybe one like your own or one that you might think of stereotypically, but instead envision a space where all of the cubicle walls were ripped down. Plastic microphones are scattered around for spontaneous mic drop moments. The coffee machine is constantly bubbling. A conference room is renamed the Fourge Fort and serves as a rendezvous point for what we call creative huddles. And a group of insanely creative people are clacking on their keyboards and clicking their mouses to tell the stories of some pretty extraordinary people and companies. In a nutshell, that is Fourge Social. That's the essence of who we are, and I'm really, really proud to be a part of that team. More obviously, if I was going to break down what we do into one sentence, I would say that we simplify everything that's complicated about social media marketing and manage it effectively for clients. Today, we're going to be talking about the power of storytelling. And as you manage your marketing efforts, the one key message to keep in mind is to keep it simple. If you're planning on taking notes, that's the first bullet point you can go ahead and write down. So I think that we're off to a good start. I said I was going to ask you a question at the beginning, and so I'd like you to watch this quick animation that you see on your screen. And please take just a quick moment in the chat to write down what you see happening. You can describe what you see on the screen here in just one sentence or two. I would love to see your responses. In the meantime, we'll wait just a few seconds while we watch the animation, and then we'll chat about it afterwards.
Anna, some of the answers you're getting is shapes bouncing around a box, entry into a room and exiting, moving shapes.
Moving shape.
Someone going into a door.
Okay. Can everybody still see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So you're probably wondering why I asked all of you guys to go ahead and write down in the chat what you saw from this kind of bizarre and old school looking animation. What I'd like to say is that this isn't a quiz, there's no wrong answer, and I'm just curious to see what you guys said. It's interesting to hear information about people going in and out of a door, describing some sort of a scene where multiple things are interacting with one another. But to give you a little bit of context as to why I asked this question, an experiment was conducted in 1944 by Fritz Heider and Marion Simmel, which, among other things, explored the nature of humans to create narratives. I actually first found out about this from an actual physical textbook in the library at Loras College when I was researching a paper for school that I had to write, but it's kind of always stuck with me since. In the first experiment, they instructed participants to watch this animation. This is the actual animation that they showed in their experiment, and they asked participants to write down what happened. As simple as that. 32 of the 34 participants described the shapes as people, and 2 of them described them as birds. In reality, they are just moving shapes, and a couple of people did say that, but our brains automatically interpret this animation as some sort of a story, or our brains tend to interpret this animation as some sort of a story. And it sounds like several people that responded in the chat did the same exact thing. So that gives you a brief introduction as to the fact that as humans, we naturally want to tell stories. We are storytellers instinctively across all of the generations, and our brain wants to interpret information into stories. And so that's going to be an important foundation for our conversation today. So what we'll review today is, what is storytelling? Why is it effective? Why do you do it? And a couple of examples that I think will help provide some context as you go forward with adjusting your marketing efforts or ramping up your marketing efforts with this storytelling principle. When I was thinking about presenting today for the Business Builder workshop, and I thought, okay, if I'm going to be trying to explain to people the importance of incorporating storytelling in your marketing, it might make sense to define what storytelling is. When I was doing that and I was working up this slide, all of a sudden I kind of realized to myself that yes, a definition seems like a great place to start, but in reality, we all know exactly what storytelling is. We understand what marketing is, but we don't always understand how to do either of those things effectively or how they can work together effectively. So that's the main focus of the conversation today, but as we all know, storytelling is just the telling or writing of stories. It's something that we do on a daily basis as humans, whether we realize it or not. As I was thinking about how to discuss storytelling with everybody, there are a lot of ways that we can find common ground with storytelling, but one of the things we can do is decide that there are a lot of stories that exist in the world, a countless number of them, whether it's books, movies, song lyrics, tales your grandmother told you, myths that were passed down through cultures and generations. But we can all agree that there are certain stories that have stood the test of time and have been some of the most famous stories ever written. The BBC conducted kind of an experiment and a poll, and they tried to create a list of the top 100 most influential stories that have ever been written. Sounds like an incredibly daunting task, if you ask me, because so many stories have been written and produced throughout human history. But the #1 story that they were identifying through this poll was the Odyssey. And some of us may have read it in school, some of us may not, some of us may have read it and forgotten about it, but a lot of us know of the Odyssey and know that it is an influential piece of work. The Odyssey was written in the 8th century BC, and so it's been around for a couple thousand years, which is pretty insane to think about. But when they were trying to describe why the Odyssey is arguably one of the most influential stories that's ever been written, one of the people that they interviewed and spoke with said, because it's one of the great foundational myths of Western culture, because it asks what it means to be a hero, because it has great female characters in it as well as men, because it's full of gods and monsters and it's properly epic, and because it forces us to question the assumptions we might have about quests, war, and the ever-current issue of what it means to return home. If that doesn't give you a great little overview of what the Odyssey is, I'm not sure what else could, but obviously it includes just about everything that a fantastic story should include, whether it's heroes, challenges, questions of what it means to be human and how we interact with one another, whether it's through war or quests or supporting one another and so on and so forth. So that definitely gives us a good baseline for understanding what the elements of a story are that carry us and what those elements are that can make a story more compelling than another. So on that note, what do also good stories include? If I asked you to answer this question for me, a lot of you would probably say at least some of these 6 kind of main categories that I've identified in this presentation, and you definitely can convince me that other main elements are important in stories, but these are kind of the main 6 that I identified that I think are important for us to consider, especially when we look at storytelling within a marketing context. So we'll go through each of these 6 elements to good stories and kind of talk about how then that can translate into marketing. First and foremost, you have to have characters. I think every single one of you would agree with me in the fact that a story has to have some sort of character, whether it's the narrator or the people that the story is being told about or whose perspective it's being told from. The important thing to think about when we think about characters in a story is we might consider heroes and villains, and that's pretty much the most common way to describe characters in a story. But when we're looking at it from a marketing perspective and you're trying to figure out who the characters of your story is for your brand or your business, it's important to realize that the hero in the story isn't you. It's not your business, it's not your product or your service, it's actually your customer. So keep that in mind as we go through the rest of the presentation. Number 2 is you have to have some sort of a conflict or challenge. When we're thinking about, what happens to characters in a story, more often than not, they're experiencing some sort of difficult challenge that they have to overcome or facing some sort of internal conflict. They have to have some sort of a guide or friend, typically some other support piece to that story, somebody that helps guide them through that conflict, that challenge. Then they find some sort of solution or some sort of support, whether it's from the guide or a friend helps them find that solution or support. And once they have that, they typically get called to action, whether it's by that friend or guide, by society, by their culture, by the people that they want to protect or the people that they're trying to save. And then and hopefully they find success. Obviously, there are tragedies and there are types of stories that result in a not so happy ending, but more often than not, a really good story and the one that we really like to listen to is one where our main characters end up finding success in the end. I think that I probably have all of you following along with me, but just in case I lost you, I'll use a very, very common story as an example to explain why these 6 elements I think are some of the most basic. We think about Star Wars, if anybody's a Star Wars fan. Luke Skywalker is arguably the main character in those stories, even though there are obviously lots of main characters. He kind of acts as the hero. In terms of the conflict or challenge that he's facing, his aunt and uncle are killed very early on, and he figures out that he needs to defeat the Empire and destroy the Death Star. A guide or friend comes along to show him the way. This came in the form of Obi-Wan Kenobi or Yoda. And then eventually he finds some sort of solution or support. He's able to unlock his Jedi powers and be able to foster those and use those to be able to defeat Darth Vader. In Call to Action, he realizes that it's up to him to be able to support the rebellion, and the rebellion is who kind of calls him to action, in addition to his own personal desire to be able to resolve the conflicts that he's facing. And ultimately, as we know, he finds success. So there's a great example of how those 6 elements are included in a very common story that a lot of us know. The most important thing to remember, though, outside of those 6 elements, is to keep it simple. There's a fantastic book for those of you who are interested in this topic and interested in learning more about how you can incorporate storytelling into your marketing. The book is called Building a Story Brand by Donald Miller, if you haven't heard of it. It is a #1 New York Times bestseller, and it's a fantastic book and something I definitely recommend to people who are interested in this topic. But there's a really great quote in that book that kind of always stuck with me, and so I went back to find it for this presentation. Donald Miller says that whether we use our marketing personnel within our organization or we hire an outside agency like Fourge or somebody else to be able to assist you with your marketing efforts, if we don't clarify what our message is and keep it simple, we might as well be holding a bullhorn up to a monkey. The only thing the potential customer is going to hear is noise. I think that's a really powerful image and really helps to understand why it's super important to make sure that you clarify your image and keep it simple. So however those 6 elements of a story manifest in your marketing, make sure it's easy to understand and you have your message abundantly clear. Now that we've talked about kind of the elements that are included in storytelling, it's important for us to discuss what makes a story effective. There's a lot of different things that can make a story effective, but a couple of examples are that they're universal. As humans, we want to be able to better understand the human experience, and that's the one thing that we have in common. And so universal stories that we can instantly recognize and understand are super important. I know that a lot of you probably already know this, but if you don't, I hate to break it to you that a lot of movie plots tend to be really predictable. And that's because they follow a formula of good storytelling that makes you want to come back and listen to the same story over and over again in a lot of different forms. It includes a lot of those main 6 elements that I described, but the reason why we keep watching films that we can predict the plot of is because they typically are focused on some sort of universal understanding of who we are as people. And it makes us want to listen to the whole story and hear it time and time again. Good stories are also organized. If you jumped into a story and started jumping from a bunch of different perspectives and timelines, but never drawing a clear connection about how your characters are getting from point A to point B at the end of the story, you're going to lose us. If you've ever watched a film where you can't instantly or within a reasonable amount of time in the film understand what's happening and what the goal is, you typically say it was a bad movie. The script wasn't written in a way that kept you entertained, it kept you educated, it kept you involved. And if we can't understand things because things are disorganized, you're going to lose us. Entertaining is another piece that I just mentioned. Obviously, a lot of good stories are entertaining. They just capture our attention because they're compelling. There's something new that we haven't seen. There's somebody that's doing something we wish we could do as people. Or we're learning about somebody else's experience. And by learning about somebody else's experience, you have us entertained and interested because we don't have the opportunity to step into their shoes otherwise. But lastly, as I mentioned earlier, good stories are easy to understand. And that is a theme that you'll find throughout this entire workshop. So now that I've kind of talked about what is included in a good story, what makes a story effective, and how storytelling really is a compelling way to consider your marketing efforts, the main question becomes, why should we use storytelling in marketing? We get that storytelling is something that a lot of people enjoy when they're consuming content, whether it's film or books or things like that. But why should we use it with marketing, and how does that help? In 3 main ways, as best as I can describe, it helps us remember, it helps us connect, and it helps us to understand. So when we're looking at the points of it helps us to remember, I bet every single person on this presentation has heard a song at some point on a radio or at an event that they haven't heard for 5, 10, 15, 20 years, and you still know all of the lyrics, but you can't remember a takeaway from a meeting that you had a couple of days ago. You can't remember what you had for dinner last night, but for some reason, those song lyrics stick with you. Obviously, part of it is because as humans, we love music, and if we put anything to a tune or a beat, it makes it easier to understand, but also because in song lyrics, you're telling a story. And you tend to really gravitate towards songs that either have a good beat or tell a good story. Take it from Heider and Simmel, the experiment that I showed at the beginning of this presentation, or from the psychologist Jerome Bruner, who found that we're 22 times more likely to remember a fact that's wrapped in a story. I believe it. Number 2, it helps us to connect. The one thing, as I mentioned, that we all have in common is the fact that we're human, and we all want to try to understand the human experience better and better. Humans have been connecting and telling stories literally since the beginning of time, whether it was drawings on a cave wall or some of the first written records of language. They're riddled through our films, our music, our books, myths that are told, stories that your grandmother tells you, and so on and so forth. And lastly, they help us to understand. Something that's important to understand about how the brain works is that your brain's sole function, and the only thing that it exists for, is to help you survive. Your brain is responsible for making sure that your body functions the way that it's supposed to, and also you have a consciousness that helps you be able to collect all of the things that you need to be able to survive in life. You think of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, making sure that you have food and water and shelter, company and camaraderie, and all of those sorts of things come along with it too, but at the most basic function, your brain is there to make sure that you survive. While your brain's working 100% of the time, all the time, every single second, it wants to work as efficiently as possible. I don't blame it. Its sole function is for survival, and so our brain uses stories and familiar patterns and things that we recognize to be able to make sense of what's happening around us as quickly as possible. It makes sense why, when we look at the experiment that I showed earlier in the animation of the shapes, that a lot of us tend to interpret that as maybe the triangles fighting each other, the circle kind of retreating within some sort of a structure. And in reality, it's just a bunch of shapes. It's geometry, and it's really not all that compelling. But when we see the way that those shapes are interacting, our brains want to build a story around it. And that shows that we have kind of an inherent nature to tell stories as a way to understand things that we're experiencing and interacting. So, another example from the book Building a Story Brain by Donald Miller, there's kind of an analogy that he makes to better understand why our brains want to make stories, and then why that shows it's an important reason to include storytelling in your marketing. He says that if you go into some sort of a ballroom, think about the Hotel Julian or the Grand River Center right here in Dubuque, and you're going in maybe for a chamber event. Obviously pre-COVID times, we'll hopefully be back to that soon, but if you think about going to some sort of a symposium, a YP luncheon, a business builder workshop, for example, and you're in that room for, say, an extended period of time, you leave the room and you probably have absolutely no idea how many chairs were in that room, because it doesn't make sense and it's not important for you to pay attention to that. But you did know where all of the exits were and how many there were without even consciously paying attention and saying, I need to know where the exits are. Your brain automatically, if you left that room, could picture where those exits are and how many of them there were, because your brain is focused on survival, and it understands that understanding where the exits are is really important, whereas knowing how many chairs were in the room isn't. Our subconscious minds are always categorizing information and trying to make sense of our experience and how it'll help us. So as I mentioned, Building a Story Brain also points out that when we focus on the fact that, for example, our manufacturing plant is the biggest in the West or in the Midwest, or there's some sort of random backstory to our company that we're really focusing on in our messaging, it doesn't connect to why the customer will benefit from your product or service. And so when you're doing that, you're positioning yourselves as the chairs rather than the exits. You're becoming an afterthought, if that even. So with that being said, now that we kind of understand why it's important to make sure that we're positioning ourselves correctly and we're trying to focus on the basic needs of humans to survive and tell stories, I want to give you 5 tips on how to become a better storyteller. That's ultimately why you're here for this workshop. Number 1, clarify your message. This is something we've heard about earlier in the presentation, but it is truly the most important thing when you consider storytelling in your marketing. What is the message that you're trying to communicate? Or what are the messages that you're trying to communicate? Do you have too many? Should you simplify those? Can you boil them down into one sentence? And if you can't, it might be important for you to kind of reevaluate that. Another example that's provided in Building a Story Brand is the author was talking about how his branding agency was working with a client that was a business that painted a variety of things, whether it was concrete and buildings, and the agent or the client was trying to describe their services in a really complex way and saying, well, you can't really boil down our products and services just into one sentence, because we do so many things and we work in so many industries and provide so many services that it's impossible to narrow down our message. And the author said, truthfully, if you boil it down, the message is that you paint a lot of stuff and we can give you a quote for just about anything. And the client realized, yeah, that kind of is what we do. And when you boil down complex products and services into something that simple, you have a really solid foundation for building a story, because If you can't easily and simply communicate what you're doing to your customers, they're not going to be able to understand it. In addition to clarifying that message, you have to decide, is it relevant, particularly to your audience, not just to you. If there's something that you think is important to communicate, you have to understand if it's serving internal goals or your inside perspective of the company, or if what you're trying to communicate is actually relevant to the needs and the challenges or the conflicts that your characters in your story, aka your customers, are facing. Is it simple? Can your team repeat it easily? That's another big thing. If you're trying to clarify the message that's going to be at the core of a lot of your marketing, you have to make sure that your team understands it too and can be able to repeat it very easily to make sure that your message is consistent everywhere where your products and services are being communicated. And lastly, is it compelling? Is it entertaining? Is it essential, maybe, for your customers? And is your message unique? My second tip is to know your audience. Understand who they are, where they spend their time, what matters most to them, what is their biggest challenge. When you understand who they are, and not just people within the Dubuque area, for example, understand more about their personality traits, understand more about their habits, understand where do they spend their time. Is that online? Is it reading the newspaper? Is it with their families? Is it constantly out and about in the city at events or taking part in their careers? What matters most to them? What are the things that are going to be the main pillars of support in their lives? And what's missing from that? What is their biggest challenge or conflict that they, as heroes in your story, are trying to overcome? And how can you act as the guide in their story to be able to provide them with some sort of support that is going to make their lives better, more efficient, and easier? Something to think about is, an example would be if you are a lawn care business and you are trying to communicate your message to your customers, and you're trying to convince them that they need to use your services because their grass is going to be greener than any other person that uses any other landscaping or lawn care company. That's great, but if you think about the needs of your customers, it may not be necessarily that they have the greenest lawn, but that their lawn is taken care of by somebody else and they can save time and therefore focus on their other essential needs in life, whether it's managing their careers, taking care of their kids, navigating busy schedules, so on and so forth, when they know that their lawn is in your hands. So it's something to think about when you're trying to understand who your audience is, not just understanding your products and services better than anybody else, which you do, but also understanding what your audience cares about more than anything else and how your product and service can act as that form of support for the heroes in your story. Next, you want to consider the medium when you're trying to become a better storyteller. Does your story fit better on social media, in other digital ads, like on Google, for example, in television, in the newspaper, on a billboard, in email marketing, in various industry spaces or publications? It's important to know that if your story that you're trying to tell is better communicated visually, the newspaper probably isn't the best place to put it, or try to force it to conform to a newspaper format. Instead, maybe a television ad or a video on social media makes better sense. Maybe an Instagram account makes better sense because it is a very visual platform. So think about the medium that you're going to tell your story through and whether or not all of the mediums you're currently using in your marketing efforts make sense for communicating the core message that you're trying to communicate. The other important thing to consider is how the mediums connect. So it's perfectly fine to use multiple mediums to market your message, and a lot of us do. But it's important to understand how the storytelling that you're doing on social media is going to connect to the storytelling that you're doing in the newspaper or in a billboard or in email campaigns and so on and so forth. You want to make sure that message is consistent and it builds upon itself through all of those different marketing mediums that you're using. My fourth tip is to brainstorm a lot. My recommendation is to create a web map like you see here on the screen, whether it's on a big whiteboard in your conference room or even just on a piece of paper at your desk. Sit down and start making web maps. Make one for your organization as a whole. Make one for each of your services, make one for each of your products, make one for each of your departments, anything that's relevant to the way that your business or organization is constructed. And some of the things that I would make sure to include or to think about when you're brainstorming how you're going to tell your story, what your message is going to be, what the elements are going to be, so on and so forth, is identify like 5 W's of your organization, your product, your service, your department. Understand your brand benefits and write down what those are. Write down proud moments, successes and celebrations, testimonials from customers, things throughout your company's history that are important to your customer and not just you, but proud moments that you have. Think behind the scenes. Think about how your services happen on a day-to-day basis. Think about how your products are produced. Think about how the talents on your teams are better serving your customers and making their lives better. Feature your people. Your teams are the ones that are doing all of the work to make sure that your products and services are being, presented and available and helpful to your customers. So focus on, their realities. Think about customer profiles, as I mentioned, whether it's picking out a specific person's name and saying, Anna Johnson, who is 24 years old, who works in this industry, who lives in Dubuque, Iowa, so on and so forth. You can identify a specific person in a customer profile, or think a little bit more generally about putting your customers into a couple of different main personas or profiles. And also think about what makes you unique. Compared to your competitors, what do you do differently? What do you do more effectively? How do you help your customers better than they do? And finding that kind of unique selling point is probably going to be the core of one of your messages in some way, shape, or form. My other tip for this specific tip, so within my tip to go ahead and brainstorm, is to talk to all of your departments. I think what's interesting too, and what people tend to forget when they're working within the marketing industry, is that you're coming at viewing the lens of your organization's services or products from a marketing perspective. We're thinking about how we can tell stories, we're thinking about how to write the best copy and how to find the best images and so on and so forth. But we're not always thinking about the products and services holistically. Talk to customer service, talk to your production teams, talk to your executive teams, talk to your IT department, talk about your products and services and interview people from all departments and all different perspectives within your organization, because it's possible that when you're thinking about things from a marketing mindset, you're missing some really important messages that only people in other departments can make you aware of. Then my last tip for how to become a better storyteller is to not force it. So don't force it. Our brains, as I mentioned earlier, like to follow well-established formulas. We like when there's a very clear story to follow within a story. So we have characters, we have some sort of a conflict, we have a guide or a friend that comes along that provides some sort of support that ultimately leads them to act and then eventually become successful. We like being able to follow the A plus B equals C kind of formula, 1 + 2 = 3. And what we say to our customers and what our customers hear are often two different things. Your customers are going to always make decisions based off of what they hear and not what you say. So you have to make sure that when you're trying to define your message, you're focusing on closing the gap between what you're saying and what your customers are hearing, and you're not trying to force some message that they don't understand or that doesn't make sense to them or that's not relevant to them. So make sure that when you are defining your story in marketing, you're understanding, what are we saying? What are our customers hearing? Are those the same thing? And if they're not, how can we make them the same thing quickly? So with that, I'm going to provide a couple of examples as to how the storytelling comes to light in real life examples. So I'll show a couple of international or big companies first, and then a couple of local examples too. This is a particular marketing campaign that I really loved that I saw a couple of years ago and has stuck with me ever since. Stabilo, which is a kind of art supplies sort of company that exists internationally, created this campaign to promote their highlighters. But instead of telling a story about their highlighters, they told a story about something else that was more compelling, more interesting, more relevant to their audience, and used their highlighters as a medium or as a way to tell that story. So throughout this campaign, I believe a lot of it was based in print, whether it was in magazines or things like that. They had page spreads like this where they had photos from history, some that were super recognizable and some that weren't. And the campaign was called Highlight the Remarkable. That was the story. They were telling the story of people like Katherine Johnson, who I'm sure that some of you are familiar with if you've seen the movie Hidden Figures. But she was a NASA mathematician that was responsible for the calculations that brought Apollo 11 back to Earth. It was a huge moment in history, and she was one of the quote unquote hidden figures that wasn't necessarily recognized right away for her contributions. And they used that in their marketing campaign to highlight her in the background of this photo, where typically she would be completely insignificant or inconsequential. When we're looking at this picture, you wouldn't even see her because she's so small and in the background, and she wasn't a part of the main narrative, but she was massively important to this historical moment. So the story that they told was one that was relevant to their customers, that was compelling, and that made sure that they were providing some sort of education or information to them in a way that was easy to understand, but they use their products as a way to do it. So I think that that's a fantastic example of storytelling. Another example that was more recent is anybody who watched the Grammys or has been watching television since within the past week or so. You've maybe seen this commercial for Apple AirPods. I don't watch cable all that often, but I have seen it a couple of times as I've been tuning in for March Madness games and things like that. And this Apple AirPods commercial was one that they released for the Grammys, and they've had out since then. And basically the premise of the commercial, for those of you who haven't seen it, is very quickly at the beginning of the commercial, there's a shot of the Apple AirPods case, which are the wireless headphones. There's a quick shot of the main character in the commercial putting the AirPods into his ears. And then the rest of the commercial shows him kind of dancing and grooving along to the music that he's listening to through the AirPods. He's jumping rope, which shows that he's super active and he's not inhibited by this piece of technology that's allowing him to listen to this music and kind of escape from it. And it's a really fun kind of high energy commercial. What I think is interesting about this when we think about a storytelling perspective is that it's focused on the customer experience more than the product itself. So Apple could have made a commercial that said, you know, these are our AirPods. Look at this super sleek design that we're super proud of, that took us a super long time to be able to actually, you know, engineer. Has a super long battery life. We decided to make them white for X, Y, and Z reasons. They're shaped like this, so that way they fit better in your ears and they don't fall out, and so on and so forth. And you'd lose a lot of your customers, because while some people are interested in the technical aspect of it, a lot of people that are looking to purchase wireless headphones are looking to purchase wireless headphones for the fact that they don't have wires, to make sure that they can go about and live their lives a lot more freely without being inhibited by constantly catching or snagging their wires in something else. And also being able to do things even more rigorous than just walking around, but like jumping rope and actively, you know, exercising or things like that with the AirPods in their ears. So again, they focused on the customer experience rather than the product itself when they were using storytelling to create this commercial. They identified what they wanted, what the customers wanted, and gave them a tool to be able to express themselves through what the customers were wanting. So I think that this is a simple commercial, but it's a fantastic current example of how you can tell stories about your product. Besides those examples, you might be saying, okay, that's all fine and great, but we don't have, you know, thousands and thousands of dollars to commit to creating a super snazzy commercial to promote our products. And so I'm going to show a couple of examples of clients of Fourge's and people that we've worked with here locally to show you how you can do it on a smaller level every day with social media content or other marketing messages that you're putting out. This is a client of ours, Windpro Performance Products, and they are a dog supplement company based out of Ankeny, Iowa, and they create dog supplements for a variety of ailments that dogs suffer from, but their most common one is their mobility supplement, which focuses on helping dogs to be able to move better and easier, particularly if you think of a dog with arthritis that limps and gimps and is really sore and, you know, can't get around very well. The mobility supplement helps to decrease the inflammation in the dog's joints and allow them to kind of live their best life as a result. Something that we focused on over the past couple of years is using a lot of user-generated content, and so encouraging customers of Windpro through a variety of incentives to share videos with us of their dog's experience before videos and after videos of using their supplements. This video in particular was of a dog named Sydney, which was a particularly successful video that we used for, I would say, almost a year in our marketing efforts back in 2018, 2019. And this video in particular was great because it didn't focus necessarily on the product, but it focused on the dog's experience and how the dog's life was dramatically improved by using Windpro Mobility. Better yet, if you look at the copy that we used as well, we weren't focusing on Windpro, but we were rather focusing on how this dog's life was improved by using Windpro. We said, does your dog have a limp and gimp? Check out the amazing results Kimberly saw when she gave her mobility supplements to her 8-year-old dog, Sydney. Before Windpro, Sydney was constantly having mobility issues due to arthritis despite weight loss and having a healthy diet. After trying mobility, Sydney returned to her silly, playful self. We focused on making sure that the customer, or in this case the dog, was the hero in the story. We focused on identifying a conflict that a lot of people can kind of universally and quickly understand, especially if they have senior dogs. We focused on the fact that there was some sort of solution or guide or source of support, which was the Windpro supplements. We focused on the fact about how then that source of support made the dog ultimately successful in its endeavor to live a better life and go back to the mobility that it had when it was younger. We did promote this campaign and this video a couple of times, but this video reached over 41,000 people and had just shy of 400 engagements in its first posting and its first kind of promotion. And so it really was a super effective way for us to tell the story of the Windpro performance products supplements. And it was a shining example for us as we were running ads to also then result in purchases. Because you might say, this is a great story, but how is it actually convincing customers to purchase the product? When we promoted this video in some of our ad campaigns on Facebook, we ended up having a 6-time return on ad spend on the amount that we spent on the promotions versus the amount of profit that the company was making as a result. So it was great. Looking at a couple of other local examples, Lang Sign Group is a client of ours, and they make signs for companies all over the area. And a lot of people might be thinking about that business and say, it's kind of boring. I don't totally understand, how sign making could be interesting, for example. But Natalie is one of our team members, and she took a behind-the-scenes time-lapse video of their vinyl expert, Steve, who was working on actively making a sign in their workshop. And this time-lapse video was super successful for them in getting people to very quickly and easily understand what they do as a business, and also why they're the experts and why it makes sense to choose Lang for all of your sign needs. So she ended up promoting this as an advertisement and said that it performed very well too, but this is a shining example of how you can use behind the scenes content and feature your people to also tell a story about your products and services. A couple of other examples, we also started recently working with Compass to Care, and obviously when you were talking about the nonprofit world, focusing on the people that are benefiting from your support and the fundraising that you're doing is a really compelling and heartwarming way to tell a story about your products and services. And so in this case with the nonprofit, this post in particular earlier this month focused on how COVID-19 has affected a lot of children and a lot of families, and how Compass to Care is there to make sure that Kate and her family and things like that had all of the support that they needed from Compass to Care. Another local example that was posted quite a few years ago when Fourge was just kind of becoming an agency, but it's something that always sticks in my mind, is Christine Mellis, who's our Director of Sales and Operations, was working with Dave Sandman, who is a Remax retailer, and he's a client that we still have to this day. And they filmed a really fun dash cam carpool karaoke video where they were singing and entertaining people through storytelling, but also then in between songs worked in a couple of questions about what he does as a retailer, focusing on his personality and why he might be a great fit for you if you're looking for a retailer in the area. And so rather than filming a video where Dave sat down in front of the camera and said, these are all the things that make me a great retailer, he showcased his personality and made sure that he was telling a story about himself in the process. And Christine did a fantastic job of creating a really fun and entertaining story out of that idea. So based on all of the information that I just shared, the thing that I can say over and over and over again is to focus on people, because people like reading, hearing, seeing stories about other people, and keep it simple. because your customers are focused on solving a problem. You have a product or service that can help them solve that problem, but focus on how you can do that rather than on your product and service itself. And lastly, it comes down to 3 questions. If there's anything you can take away from this presentation, it is to ask yourself these 3 questions when you start figuring out how to tell better stories in your marketing, and then take those answers to build an actual story. What does your hero need? Again, the hero is the customer, not you. What is standing in his or her way of being able to get what they need? And what will be the benefit if they choose you as their guide or their friend or their source of support to help them succeed? So with that, that's the end of my presentation. I hope that it was informative. I hope it was helpful. I hope it helped you better understand what storytelling is, why it's important in our marketing efforts, and how you can do it more effectively. I'm super thankful that I had the chance to come and speak with you all today. If you'd like to connect further, you can certainly email me. My email's on the screen, or you can connect with Fourge Social on all of these social media platforms. We also have a blog on our website that has a lot of additional information if you're looking for it. And with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions that I can.
Thank you so much, Anna. That was fantastic. The examples were great. I just kind of makes you motivated and inspired to continue your own story. If you guys want, please put questions in the chat while we're waiting for those. I actually have one, and I don't want to put you on the spot, but those are great examples of good storytelling. Do you have any examples of a bad storytelling campaign that you've seen that you thought you're missing the mark?
I'll have to, I don't know if I have a specific example where I could call, you know, a specific commercial to mind or a print ad or something like that that I've seen. But I think that one of definitely the worst things that you can do is put too much information in a campaign, because people want to understand who you are and what you're about as quickly as possible. And so if you're trying to communicate too many messages at once, that tends to be when you end up telling a bad story.
Very good. Well, I don't see anything coming in the chat at this time, but Anna has provided multiple ways to get a hold of her. You can also get a hold of the chamber if you have any questions, and we can direct them to her. On behalf of myself, Darren Harmon, our board chair, and the entire chamber staff, thank you so much for joining us today. We appreciate you spending your morning with us, and we look forward to seeing you at our next Business Builder event in April. Thank you all, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, everybody.